My name is Michael Torres. I just turned 18, and I thought becoming an adult meant freedom, independence, maybe getting to vote or buy lottery tickets. Instead, it meant finally being big enough, strong enough, and legally empowered enough to do what I had wanted to do since I was 8 years old: stop my father from hitting my mother. This is the story of 10 years spent watching violence I was too young to prevent, and one night when everything changed, because I was finally old enough to fight back. It was my 18th birthday, October 15th, a Tuesday. I woke up in my bedroom in the house where I had grown up, in the house where I had witnessed things no child should ever see, and I realized that today was different from every other birthday I had ever had. Today, I was legally an adult. Today, if something happened, I could intervene without worrying about being a minor interfering in adult business. Today, I had power I had never had before. I did not know yet that I would need that power before the day was over. I did not know that my 18th birthday would also be the day everything finally changed. I just knew that I felt different, bigger, stronger, ready. Let me back up. Let me tell you about the 10 years that led to this moment. Let me tell you about being 8 years old and realizing that the man who was supposed to protect you was actually the most dangerous person in your world. I was in 3rd grade the first time I saw my father hit my mother. It was a Saturday morning. I had come downstairs for breakfast and found them in the kitchen arguing about something I did not understand. Bills, maybe. Money. Adult things that 8-year-olds do not pay attention to. My mother said something, her voice tired and frustrated, and my father's hand shot out so fast I almost did not see it. The sound of the slap echoed in the kitchen. My mother stumbled backward, her hand going to her cheek, tears already forming in her eyes. I froze in the doorway. I did not know what to do. I did not know what was happening. I had never seen anyone hit anyone before, except maybe on TV or in movies, and this was different. This was real. This was my mother. This was my father. This was my family falling apart, right in front of me. My father saw me standing there. Go back upstairs, Michael. This does not concern you. But it did concern me. It concerned me very much, because after that day, it kept happening. Not every day, not even every week, but often enough that I learned to recognize the signs. The way my father's voice would change when he had been drinking. The way my mother would get very quiet and careful around him. The way the air in the house would feel tight and dangerous, like a storm about to break. And I was just a kid, 8 years old, then 9, then 10. Too small to do anything. Too young to understand what was happening or why. Too scared to intervene. Because what if he hit me too? What if I made it worse? What if trying to help my mother just made my father angrier? So I did what most children in my situation do. I hid. When the yelling started, I would go to my room and close the door and put on headphones and try to drown out the sounds. When I heard my mother cry, I would pull my pillow over my head and pretend I was somewhere else. When I saw bruises on my mother's arms or face, I would pretend I did not notice, because noticing meant acknowledging what was happening, and acknowledging it meant having to face my own helplessness. My mother tried to protect me from it. She would send me to my room before arguments started. She would make excuses for the bruises. She fell. She bumped into something. She was clumsy. She never admitted what was really happening, even though we both knew. Even though I had seen it with my own eyes dozens of times by the time I was 10 years old. I called the police once. I was 11. My father had pushed my mother so hard she fell and hit her head on the kitchen counter. There was blood. She was crying. And I ran to the phone and dialed 911 and told them my father was hurting my mother and they needed to come help. The police came. They talked to my father, who was calm and reasonable by the time they arrived. They talked to my mother, who said it was just an accident, that she had fallen, that everything was fine. They looked at me like I was a kid who did not understand what he had seen. And then they left. And my father looked at me with an expression I will never forget, a mixture of anger and warning that told me very clearly that if I ever did that again, things would get much worse. I never called the police again, not when I was 11 or 12 or 13, not when the violence got worse, more frequent, more dangerous, not when I started to worry that one day my father might actually kill my mother, because I had learned that calling for help did not actually help. It just made things more complicated and more scary. So I waited. I grew. I got bigger and taller and stronger. I went from being a small, scared 8-year-old to a teenager who was almost as tall as his father. I worked out in the school gym, lifting weights, building muscle, preparing myself for something I did not have words for yet. I was getting ready. I just did not know for what. By the time I was 16, I was 6 feet tall and 170 pounds. I was bigger than my mother, almost as big as my father, but I was still a minor, still legally a child, still without the authority or power to really change anything, still just watching and waiting and hating myself for not being able to stop what was happening. My junior year of high school, I started seeing the school counselor, not because I wanted to, but because a teacher noticed something was wrong. She saw me flinch when someone raised their hand too quickly. She noticed how I always sat with my back to the wall, always watching doorways, always on alert. She asked me if everything was okay at home, and I lied and said yes. But she did not believe me, so she sent me to the counselor. Mrs. Patterson was patient and kind and persistent. She asked careful questions. She never pushed too hard. And eventually, over weeks of sessions, I told her. I told her about my father and my mother and the violence I had been witnessing since I was 8 years old. I told her I felt helpless and angry and guilty for not being able to stop it. I told her I was terrified that one day I would come home and find my mother seriously hurt or worse. Mrs. Patterson told me about resources, about domestic violence hotlines, about shelters, about legal options. She told me that what was happening was not normal, that it was abuse, that my mother and I both deserved better. She told me that I was not responsible for my father's actions, that I had not caused any of this, that it was not my job to fix it. But I did not want to hear about resources or hotlines or shelters. I wanted to know what I could do, right now, today, to make it stop. And the answer was not much. Not until I was 18. Not until I was legally an adult who could make my own decisions about staying or leaving, about intervening or calling police, about protecting myself and my mother without needing a parent's permission. So I counted down 730 days until I turned 18, then 600, then 400. Every day was another day closer to being big enough and old enough and legally empowered enough to finally do something. Every day was another day of watching my mother suffer and feeling like a coward for not stopping it. My mother knew I was planning something. She did not know what, but she knew. She would look at me sometimes with this expression of fear mixed with hope, like she wanted me to save her, but was terrified of what it might cost me. She would tell me to focus on school, to think about college, to not worry about her. She would say she was fine, everything was fine, things would get better. But things did not get better. They got worse. As I got bigger and stronger, as I started to look less like a boy and more like a man, my father started to see me as a threat. He would make comments about me thinking I was tough, about me disrespecting him, about me needing to learn my place. He never hit me. He saved his violence for my mother. But there was always this tension between us, this unspoken understanding that a confrontation was coming eventually. Senior year started. I turned 17 in October, which meant I had one more year until I was 18. One more year of waiting and watching and preparing. I applied to colleges, mostly as a formality, because I knew I was not going anywhere. I could not leave my mother alone with him. Not now. Not when I was almost strong enough to protect her. And then, finally, October 15th came around again. My 18th birthday. I woke up feeling different. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw a man, not a boy. 6 feet 2 inches. 185 pounds. Broad shoulders. Strong arms. I looked like someone who could stop a punch. Someone who could stand between my mother and my father and say no more. My mother made me breakfast. Pancakes, my favorite. She sang happy birthday in a voice that was trying to be cheerful, but could not quite hide the sadness underneath. She gave me a card with $20 in it and told me she loved me. My father was already gone, at work or a bar, or wherever he went during the day. It was just Mom and me, having a quiet birthday breakfast. Both of us knowing that something had shifted, but not saying it out loud. I went to school. My friends wished me happy birthday. My teachers nodded and smiled. Everything was normal on the outside, but inside, I was vibrating with anticipation and dread. I knew, somehow, that today was going to be the day, that my father would come home drunk and angry, that he would start something with my mother, that I would finally have to make a choice. I came home around 4 in the afternoon. My mother was in the kitchen, starting dinner. She looked tense. Your father called. He is going to be late. He has been drinking. That was code. That was warning. That meant tonight was going to be bad. I nodded. Okay. Michael. She looked at me. Really looked at me. Whatever you are planning, whatever you are thinking about doing, do not. Please. Just stay in your room tonight. Let me handle this. I am 18 now, Mom. I am not hiding in my room anymore. He will hurt you. You do not understand what he is capable of. I have been watching what he is capable of for 10 years. I understand perfectly. She started crying. You are my baby. I cannot let him hurt you too. And I cannot let him hurt you anymore. Not when I am finally big enough to stop it. She did not argue after that. She just hugged me tight and cried into my shoulder. And I stood there holding my mother, feeling her shake, and I made a promise to myself that tonight was the last night she would ever have to be afraid in her own home. My father came home around 8. I heard his truck in the driveway, heard the door slam, heard his heavy footsteps. He was drunk. I could tell by the way he walked, by the way he was muttering to himself. He came into the kitchen where Mom and I were sitting at the table, me pretending to do homework, her pretending to read a magazine. Where's my dinner? He said. Not hello. Not happy birthday to your son. Just where is my dinner? Like my mother was a servant instead of a person. I can heat something up for you, my mother said quietly. Already standing. Already moving toward the stove. I work all day and I come home to this. No food ready? What do you do all day? I work too, David. I just got home an hour ago. That was a mistake. Pointing out that she also worked. Pointing out that his expectations were unreasonable. I saw my father's face change, saw that familiar look of anger settling over his features, and I knew what was coming next. Do not talk back to me. I am not talking back. I am just explaining. He moved fast, faster than I expected. His hand shot out toward my mother's face. But this time I was faster. This time I was not a scared 8-year-old hiding in my room. This time, I was 18 years old, and I had been preparing for this moment for 10 years. I caught his fist midair. My hand wrapped around his wrist and stopped the punch before it could connect with my mother's face. For a second, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. We all just froze in this tableau. My father's arm extended, my hand gripping his wrist. My mother with her hands up defensively, me standing between them. And then my father looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw the exact moment when he realized that his son was no longer a scared little boy, that I was bigger than him now, stronger than him, that the balance of power in this house had shifted and he had not noticed until this very second. "Let go of me," he said. His voice was dangerous, but underneath the danger, I heard something else. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. "No," I said. "Not until you back off. This is between me and your mother. Stay out of it." I have been staying out of it for 10 years. I am done staying out of it. He tried to pull his arm away. I held firm. He tried again, harder this time, putting his weight into it. I did not budge, and I saw realization dawn in his eyes. He could not break my grip. He could not overpower me. For the first time in my entire life, my father could not physically dominate someone in this house. "You little—" He raised his other hand, and I caught that one too. Both his wrists now held firmly, keeping him away from my mother, forcing him to look at me instead of her. "You are done hitting her," I said. "You are done hurting her. You are done making her afraid in her own home. Do you understand me? You cannot tell me what to do in my own house." "Yes, I can, because I am not a kid anymore. I am 18. I am legally an adult. And I am telling you that if you ever lay a hand on her again, we are calling the police. And this time, she is going to press charges. And this time they are going to believe us. And you are going to jail." My father stared at me. I could see him processing this, see him trying to figure out how to regain control of the situation. He was used to being the most dangerous person in the room. He was used to everyone being afraid of him. But I was not afraid. Not anymore. I had been afraid for 10 years, and I was done with it. "Mom," I said, not taking my eyes off my father. "Call the police." "Michael," she started. "Call them. Now. Tell them there has been domestic violence, and you want to press charges. Tell them your son is 18, and he is a witness. Tell them to send someone right away." My father's eyes widened. "You would do that? You would send your own father to jail? You stopped being my father the first time you hit her. You are just a man who lives in this house and terrorizes the people in it, and I am not letting that happen anymore." My mother had her phone out, was dialing. My father tried one more time to pull away from me, putting all his strength into it. But I had youth and muscle and 10 years of rage fueling me. I pushed him backward, hard, until he stumbled and fell into a chair. I stood over him, ready in case he tried to get up, ready to do whatever I needed to do to protect my mother. "The police are on their way," my mother said. Her voice was shaking but determined. "I told them everything. I told them I want to press charges. I told them I have a witness." My father looked at both of us like he could not believe this was happening, like he had never imagined a scenario where his family would stand up to him. He started to speak, to threaten, to try to regain control. But the words died in his throat when he looked at me again, because he saw what I had become, and he knew he had lost. The police arrived 15 minutes later. 2 officers, a man and a woman. They separated us. My father in the living room, my mother and me in the kitchen. They took statements. They photographed my mother's bruises, the ones she still had from 2 days ago. They asked me what I had witnessed, not just tonight, but over the years. And I told them everything. 10 years of violence, hundreds of incidents, patterns of abuse and intimidation and control. I told them about calling the police when I was 11 and nothing happening. I told them about being too young and too scared to do anything. I told them about counting down the days until I turned 18 so I could finally intervene. I told them about tonight, about catching my father's fist, about stopping him for the first time in my life. The female officer, Officer Martinez, looked at me with something like respect. "You did the right thing," she said. "A lot of kids in your situation never find the courage to speak up. I have had the courage for 10 years. I just did not have the size or the age until today." They arrested my father that night. Assault and battery, domestic violence. Multiple counts, based on my mother's and my testimony. They took him out in handcuffs, while he glared at us, while he threatened what he would do when he got out, while he blamed us for destroying the family. But we had not destroyed the family. He had done that years ago. The first time he hit my mother. The first time he made his son hide in his room terrified. We were just finally doing something about it. After the police left, after the house was quiet, my mother and I sat at the kitchen table. The table where we had eaten so many meals in tense silence. The table where I had done homework while trying to ignore the sounds of arguing. The table where, hours ago, I had caught my father's fist and changed everything. "I am sorry," my mother said. "I am so sorry you had to grow up seeing that. I am sorry I did not leave sooner. I am sorry I put you in that position. You do not have to apologize, Mom. None of this was your fault. I should have protected you. I should have gotten us out of here years ago. But I was scared. I did not have money. I did not know where we would go. And I kept thinking maybe he would change, maybe it would get better. Maybe if I just tried harder." That is what he wanted you to think. That is how abusers work. They make you feel like it is your fault, like you caused it, like you could fix it if you just behave the right way. But there is no right way to behave with someone like him. There is no magic combination of words or actions that will make an abuser stop abusing. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "When did you get so wise?" "About 10 years of watching and learning and researching and preparing for this exact moment. We talked for hours that night about what came next, about my father's trial, about whether she felt safe in the house or if we should go to a shelter, about money and jobs and how we would support ourselves without his income, about restraining orders and custody and divorce proceedings, about all the practical, difficult things that come after you finally escape an abusive relationship. But underneath all the practical talk, there was something else. Relief. For the first time in 10 years, my mother could breathe. She did not have to walk on eggshells. She did not have to worry about saying the wrong thing, or doing the wrong thing, or triggering an explosion. She could just exist without fear. And watching that relief wash over her face made everything worth it. The 10 years of waiting, the guilt of not intervening sooner, the fear of what might have happened if I had tried, all of it was worth it for this moment of seeing my mother free. The next few days were chaotic. My father was released on bail, but ordered to stay away from us. We got a restraining order. My mother filed for divorce. We talked to a lawyer about the assault and battery charges and what they would mean. We changed the locks on the doors. We made plans. And I turned into my mother's protector, not because she needed protecting. She was strong. She had survived 10 years of abuse. She was capable of protecting herself now. But because I wanted to, because I had spent my entire childhood feeling helpless, and now I finally had the power to keep her safe. Because being the man who stood between her and danger was the role I had been preparing for since I was 8 years old. My friends did not understand why I was not celebrating my 18th birthday like normal teenagers do, why I was not excited about being an adult, about having freedom, about all the possibilities that came with turning 18. They did not know what had happened at my house that night. They did not know that my 18th birthday had been the day I finally saved my mother. Only Mrs. Patterson, my school counselor, understood. When I told her what had happened, she hugged me. "I am so proud of you," she said. "You did an incredibly brave thing. I just did what I should have done years ago." "No, you did what you could do when you were finally old enough and strong enough to do it. You cannot blame yourself for not being able to stop it sooner. You were a child, and now you are a young man who stood up for what was right when it mattered most. That is courage." The trial happened 3 months later. My father pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a lighter sentence. 18 months in prison, mandatory anger management and addiction counseling, a permanent restraining order keeping him away from us. It was not enough, would never be enough for 10 years of violence, but it was something. It was accountability. It was consequences. My mother and I testified anyway, even though the plea deal meant we did not have to. We wanted it on the record. We wanted the judge to hear what had happened. We wanted the world to know what kind of man David Torres really was behind the charming public persona he showed everyone outside our house. I described that night in detail. How I had caught his fist. How I had stopped him from hitting my mother for the first time in 10 years. How I had realized that I was finally big enough, strong enough, old enough to end the cycle of violence. How my 18th birthday had been the day everything changed. The judge looked at me with something like sadness. "Young man, you should never have been put in that position. No child should have to protect their parent from abuse. But you did the right thing. You potentially saved your mother's life, and you should be proud of that." I was not sure proud was the right word. I was relieved. I was glad it was over. I was hopeful about the future for the first time in 10 years. But proud? That seemed like too simple an emotion for something so complicated. After the trial, life slowly returned to a new kind of normal. My mother got a better job. We moved to a smaller apartment that we could afford on her salary. I deferred college for a year to work and help with expenses and to make sure Mom was really okay. We went to therapy, both separately and together, working through a decade of trauma. And I learned something important. Being an adult is not about age or size or legal status. It is about taking responsibility. It is about making hard choices. It is about standing up for what is right even when it is terrifying. I had technically become an adult at midnight on my 18th birthday, but I had really become an adult the moment I caught my father's fist and said no more. My 18th birthday was supposed to be about freedom and independence and starting my adult life. Instead, it was about ending a nightmare that had lasted 10 years, about using my new status as an adult to protect someone who could not protect herself, about finally being big enough to fight back against someone who had terrorized my family for my entire childhood. People ask me sometimes if I wish things had been different. If I wish I had grown up in a normal family without violence, without fear, without spending 10 years preparing to intervene in my parents' relationship. And of course I wish that. Of course I wish my mother had never been hurt, that I had never witnessed abuse, that my childhood had been about playing sports and video games instead of about counting down until I was big enough to stop my father's fists. But I cannot change the past. I can only work with what happened and try to make something meaningful from it. And what happened is that I spent 10 years feeling helpless, and then one night on my 18th birthday, I finally had the power to help. And I used that power, and it changed everything. My mother is thriving now. 2 years after that night, she is confident and happy in ways I have never seen before. She has friends. She has hobbies. She laughs. She does not flinch when someone moves too quickly or raises their voice. She is healing slowly but surely, becoming the person she might have been if she had never married my father. And me. I am in college now, studying social work. I want to help other families like mine. Other kids who are growing up witnessing violence they are too young to stop. Other survivors who need support to escape abusive relationships. I want to be for other people what Mrs. Patterson was for me, someone who sees the truth and offers help and believes that change is possible. I carry that night with me always. The night I turned 18. The night I caught my father's fist midair. The night I looked into his eyes and saw the exact moment he realized his son was no longer a scared little boy, but a man who would not tolerate abuse. That moment changed the trajectory of my entire life. People sometimes ask if I regret how I spent my 18th birthday, if I wish I had been out celebrating with friends instead of confronting my father and calling the police, and starting the process of tearing my family apart. But I do not see it as tearing my family apart. I see it as saving what was left of my family. My father made his choices years ago when he decided violence was acceptable. I just made the choice to finally stop enabling it. My name is Michael Torres. I am 20 years old now. 2 years ago, on my 18th birthday, I watched my father try to hit my mother, and I caught his fist midair. I had been waiting for that moment for 10 years. 10 years of being too small, too young, too powerless to stop the violence I witnessed. But on that night, I was finally big enough, strong enough, adult enough. The look in my father's eyes when he realized his son was no longer a scared little boy is something I will never forget. It was shock and anger and fear all mixed together, because he had lost his power, he had lost control, and he knew it. That was the night everything changed. That was the night I became the protector I had always wanted to be. That was the night my mother finally got free. And looking back now, I would not change a single thing about how that night went. Because sometimes becoming an adult is not about celebration. Sometimes it is about standing up. Sometimes it is about being brave enough to end something that should have ended years ago. Sometimes it is about using your new power to protect someone who desperately needs protection. I was a scared little boy for 10 years, but on my 18th birthday, I became a man, not because of my age, but because of my actions. And that man has spent the last 2 years building a life where violence has no place, where fear is not the baseline, where family means support instead of survival. That is what my 18th birthday gave me. Not freedom in the traditional sense, but freedom from fear, freedom from helplessness, freedom from watching someone I love get hurt and being unable to stop it. And that is worth more than any celebration could ever be. 2 years have passed since that night. 2 years of rebuilding, healing, growing. 2 years of learning what normal feels like when fear is not the constant background noise of your life. 2 years of watching my mother transform from a woman who lived in terror to a woman who lives with purpose. The legal process took longer than I expected. My father's initial plea deal fell through when the prosecution discovered a pattern of previous incidents we had not known about. Complaints from neighbors, emergency room visits where my mother had given false explanations, a prior arrest from before I was born that had been expunged but was still in the system. The evidence kept mounting, and eventually my father was sentenced to 4 years instead of 18 months. I testified at every hearing, every time his lawyer tried to get the charges reduced or the sentence shortened. I was there, 18 years old, then 19, standing up in court and describing what I had witnessed, describing the fear, describing the violence, describing the night I finally said enough. His lawyer tried to paint me as a rebellious teenager, as someone who had exaggerated or misunderstood what had happened. But the prosecutor was brilliant. She had medical records, police reports, testimony from teachers who had noticed signs. She had my mother's statement, clear and detailed and undeniable. And she had me, a young man who spoke calmly and factually about 10 years of documented abuse. The judge ultimately ruled that my father was a danger to his family and to society, that his pattern of violence was deeply ingrained and required serious intervention. 4 years in prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, mandatory counseling, and a permanent restraining order. He would never be allowed to contact my mother or me again without explicit permission from the court. I felt nothing when the sentence was read. No satisfaction, no vindication, no sense of victory. Just relief that it was finally over, that we could move forward without looking over our shoulders, that my mother could build a life without fear. The hardest part was not the legal process or the aftermath. It was the guilt, the endless, crushing guilt that came from asking myself the same questions over and over. Why did not I do something sooner? Why did I wait 10 years? How many times could I have stopped him if I had just been braver, smarter, stronger? My therapist, Dr. Williams, helped me work through those questions. She explained something that changed how I saw my entire childhood. Michael, you were a child. An 8-year-old cannot stop an adult man from committing violence. A 10-year-old cannot fix a broken marriage. A 12-year-old cannot call the police and magically make everything better. You did what you could with the resources and power you had at each age, and the moment you had the legal standing and physical capability to intervene effectively, you did. That is not failure. That is survival followed by courage. She made me write down every year from age 8 to 18. For each year, I had to list what resources I actually had. At 8, none. I was a small child with no legal rights, no physical strength, no authority. At 10, still none. The police had come when I called and left when my mother lied to protect my father. At 12, nothing had changed. At 14, I was bigger, but still a minor, still powerless in any legal sense. At 16, closer, but not close enough. Only at 18 did I finally have the combination of physical capability, legal authority, and emotional readiness to do what I had been preparing to do for 10 years. Looking at it laid out like that, seeing how powerless I had actually been for most of my childhood, helped ease some of the guilt. Not all of it. I do not think the guilt ever fully goes away when you have witnessed suffering you could not prevent, but enough that I could function, enough that I could forgive the child I had been for not being able to save his mother sooner. My relationship with my mother deepened after that night in ways I did not expect. We had always been close. Abuse has a way of bonding victims together, but now there was something different. Mutual respect. She had watched me transform from a boy who hid in his room to a man who stood up to violence. And I had watched her transform from someone who made excuses for abuse to someone who pressed charges and testified and fought for justice. We talked about things we had never talked about before. She told me about her childhood, about her own father who had been violent, about how she had thought she was marrying someone different but had somehow ended up in the same pattern. She told me about the times she had almost left, had packed bags and called her sister and made plans, only to lose her nerve at the last minute. She told me about the shame and the self-blame and the constant calculation of whether staying was more dangerous than leaving. And I told her about my childhood, about the nightmares I still had sometimes, about the hypervigilance, the way I still tensed up when I heard raised voices or saw sudden movements, about the anger I carried toward my father but also toward the system that had failed us, toward the neighbors who had heard and done nothing, toward every adult who had seen signs and looked away. We went to therapy together, family counseling to repair the parts of our relationship that had been damaged by living in survival mode for so long. Dr. Chun, our family therapist, helped us establish new patterns, how to communicate honestly instead of walking on eggshells, how to ask for help instead of suffering in silence, how to trust that anger or disagreement would not lead to violence because violence was no longer part of our dynamic. One of the things Dr. Chun had us work on was the parent-child boundary that had gotten blurred during the years of abuse. I had become my mother's protector, but I was also still her son. She was my mother, but she had also relied on me in ways that were not appropriate for a child or teenager. We needed to reestablish a healthier dynamic where she was the parent and I was the adult child, where we supported each other but did not depend on each other for survival. It was harder than it sounds. Old patterns are deeply ingrained. My mother would start to minimize something my father had done, and I would immediately get defensive, protective. I would try to make decisions for her about her safety, and she would have to remind me that she was capable of making her own choices now. We stumbled through it, made mistakes, had setbacks. But slowly, gradually, we found a new normal. My mother started dating again about a year after the divorce was finalized. His name was Richard, a kind man who worked as a middle school teacher and volunteered at an animal shelter on weekends. He was patient and gentle, and everything my father was not. The first time Mom brought him over for dinner, I interrogated him like I was conducting a police investigation. What were his intentions? Had he ever been in trouble with the law? How did he handle anger? What did he think about violence? Richard answered every question calmly and honestly. He told me he understood why I was protective, that if he had a son who had watched what I had watched, he would want that son to ask hard questions too. He told me he had no interest in replacing my father or trying to be a father figure to me. He just wanted to get to know my mother and see where things went. He told me that if I ever felt uncomfortable or saw any red flags, he hoped I would tell him directly because he genuinely cared about my mother's well-being. I decided to trust him, cautiously at first, watching for any signs of the patterns I knew so well. But Richard was exactly who he presented himself to be. Patient when my mother had bad days and needed space. Understanding when she flinched at unexpected movements. Supportive when she went to therapy or needed to talk about the trauma she was still processing. He was what a healthy relationship looked like, and watching my mother experience that was healing for both of us. As for me, I threw myself into school and work and building a future that would mean something. I had deferred college for a year after my 18th birthday to make sure Mom was stable and safe, but I started classes the following fall. I chose a state school close enough that I could come home on weekends if needed, far enough that I had my own space and independence. I declared a major in social work with a focus on family violence prevention. My experiences were not going to be wasted. Every paper I wrote, every class I took, every internship I completed was informed by what I had lived through. I knew what it felt like to be a child in an abusive home. I knew what resources existed and which ones actually helped. I knew the gaps in the system, the ways families slipped through the cracks, the reasons victims stayed, and the barriers to leaving. My professors were impressed by the depth of my understanding, though most of them did not know where it came from. Only my advisor, Professor Martinez, knew my full story. She had been a social worker before becoming an academic, had worked in domestic violence shelters and crisis intervention. When I came to her office during my sophomore year and told her why I had chosen this major, she listened without judgment and then said something that stuck with me. The best social workers are the ones who have lived experience, but you need to make sure you are healing while you are helping. You cannot pour from an empty cup. She connected me with a peer support group on campus for students from abusive backgrounds. 8 of us met every Thursday evening in a small room in the student center. We were all different ages, different backgrounds, different types of abuse. But we shared an understanding that no one outside the group could really grasp. We knew what it was like to live with fear as your baseline. We knew the complicated feelings of loving someone who hurt you. We knew the guilt and the shame and the hypervigilance. One guy in the group, James, had a story eerily similar to mine. He had watched his father abuse his mother throughout his childhood. But unlike me, James had not been able to intervene when he turned 18. His father had died in a car accident when James was 17, just months before he would have been old enough to do something. James carried different guilt than mine. The guilt of relief. Relief that his father was dead. Relief that his mother was finally safe. And the crushing shame that came with feeling relieved about a parent's death. We talked for hours about the complicated emotions that came with being the child of an abuser. The love that does not just disappear even when you know intellectually that your parent is a bad person. The anger at everyone who failed to protect you. The resentment toward the non-abusive parent for not leaving sooner. The fear that you might have inherited the abuser's tendencies, that violence might be coded into your DNA. That last fear haunted me more than I wanted to admit. I had my father's temper. I had his build, his strength, his capacity for physical dominance. What if I also had his propensity for violence? What if one day I got angry and hurt someone I loved? What if the apple really did not fall far from the tree? Dr. Williams and I spent months working through this fear. She explained the difference between anger and violence, between having a temper and being abusive. She explained that abuse is about control and power, not about anger. That my father hurt my mother not because he lost control, but because he chose violence as a tool to maintain dominance. That I could feel anger without acting on it violently because I had made different choices about who I wanted to be. She had me track my anger for a month. Every time I felt angry, I wrote down what triggered it, how intense it was, what I did with the feeling. At the end of the month, we reviewed the log together. Yes, I got angry at traffic, at unfair situations, at people who were cruel or thoughtless. But my response to anger was never violence. It was never even the threat of violence. I talked things out. I removed myself from situations that were escalating. I processed my feelings instead of acting on them impulsively. You are not your father, Dr. Williams told me. You share some genetics, some physical traits, some temperamental tendencies, but you are fundamentally different people who have made fundamentally different choices. He chose violence. You choose protection. That is not a small difference. That is everything. I started dating in college, cautiously, and with a lot of anxiety about how to explain my background. How do you tell someone that your father is in prison for assault and battery? That you grew up witnessing domestic violence? That you have PTSD and trust issues, and a hypervigilant nervous system that overreacts to raised voices? My first serious girlfriend, Ashley, was patient and understanding when I finally told her. She asked thoughtful questions. She gave me space when I needed it. She noticed when I was triggered and helped me ground myself. But eventually, the weight of my trauma became too much for the relationship. We cared about each other, but she was 20 years old and wanted a relationship that felt light and fun and uncomplicated. I could not give her that. I was too serious, too intense, too marked by what I had been through. We broke up amicably after 6 months. She told me she hoped I found someone who could hold space for all of my history without being overwhelmed by it. I told her I hoped so too, though I was not sure that person existed. But then I met Sarah. It was my junior year, in a social work seminar on trauma-informed practice. She sat 3 seats away and asked questions that demonstrated a deep understanding of how trauma impacts the nervous system. After class, I complimented her insight, and she smiled and said, "I should hope so. I have been in therapy for childhood trauma for 6 years." We got coffee. She told me her story. A mother with severe mental illness, a childhood spent in and out of foster care, siblings she had lost contact with. She told me about the work she was doing to heal, to break cycles, to become a social worker who could help other kids like she had been. And I told her my story, about my father, about my mother, about the night I turned 18 and everything changed. Sarah understood in a way no one else had, not because our traumas were the same, but because we both knew what it meant to survive something that should have destroyed you. We both knew about hypervigilance and flashbacks and the constant work of healing. We both knew that love does not erase trauma, but it can make the work of healing less lonely. We have been together for a year now. It is not always easy. We both have triggers. We both have bad days, where the past feels more real than the present. But we also have tools and skills and a commitment to being honest about what we need. When Sarah needs space, she tells me instead of pushing me away. When I need reassurance, I ask for it instead of testing whether she will stay. We are both works in progress, but we are progressing together. My mother loves Sarah. They have long conversations about therapy and healing and what it means to rebuild your life after trauma. Richard and Sarah also get along well. They bond over being the partners of people with complex histories, comparing notes on how to be supportive without being overbearing. Sometimes the four of us have dinner together, and I look around the table at these people who chose to be in my life despite knowing my history, and I feel something I did not feel for most of my childhood. I feel like I belong to a family that is built on honesty and care instead of fear and control. I am in my senior year of college now, 21 years old. 3 years since that night when I caught my father's fist and changed the trajectory of my life. I am applying to graduate programs in social work, planning to specialize in family violence intervention. I already have a job lined up for after graduation, working at a crisis center that helps families escaping domestic violence. The director of the center, Patricia Chun, interviewed me last month. She asked why I wanted this particular job, what drew me to this specific population. I told her my story, all of it, the 10 years of watching, the night I intervened, the aftermath. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, "You understand this issue from the inside in a way most social workers never will. That is valuable. But I need to know, are you healed enough to do this work without re-traumatizing yourself?" It was a fair question. I had asked myself the same thing. I am not sure anyone is ever fully healed from childhood trauma, I told her. But I am functional. I am in therapy. I have support systems. I have done enough of my own healing work that I can hold space for other people's pain without drowning in it. And I think my lived experience makes me better at this work, not worse. I know what these families are going through. I know what the kids are feeling. I know what actually helps and what just sounds good in theory. She hired me on the spot, told me the center needed people who understood the complexity of family violence, who would not judge victims for staying or for going back, or for the million complicated choices they had to make to survive. Told me that survivors often make the best advocates because we know the system from both sides. I start in June, right after graduation. I will be running support groups for teenagers from violent homes. Kids like I was. Kids who are watching and waiting and feeling helpless. Kids who need someone to tell them that what they are experiencing is not normal, that they deserve better, that they are not responsible for fixing their parents' relationship. I wish someone had told me those things when I was 10 or 12 or 14. I wish someone had seen what was happening and intervened in a way that actually helped instead of making things worse. I wish I had not spent 10 years carrying the weight of my family's dysfunction on my small shoulders. But I cannot change my past. I can only use it to help create different outcomes for other kids. I can be the adult I needed when I was young. I can be the voice that tells a scared teenager that intervention is possible, that escape is possible, that healing is possible. That is what my 18th birthday gave me, ultimately. Not just the legal standing to stop my father, not just the physical capability to intervene, but the lived experience that would become the foundation of my life's work. The understanding that would make me effective at helping other families navigate the impossible complexity of leaving abuse. Sometimes I wonder what my father thinks about now, sitting in prison. Does he reflect on his choices? Does he understand what he lost? Does he feel remorse? Or does he just feel angry that his family finally stood up to him? I do not know. I have not spoken to him since the night of my 18th birthday. He has sent letters through his lawyer asking for contact, claiming he has changed. My mother and I have both declined. Maybe someday, years from now, when I am more secure in my healing, I will be curious enough to hear what he has to say. But not yet. Not when the wounds are still this raw. My mother is thriving in ways I never imagined possible. She got promoted at work. She and Richard moved in together. She took up painting and discovered she has real talent. She volunteers at a women's shelter, helping other survivors navigate the legal and practical challenges of leaving abuse. She smiles easily now. She laughs. She makes jokes. She is becoming the person she might have always been if she had not spent 20 years walking on eggshells. Last week, she and I were having coffee, and she said something that made me tear up. "Michael, I need you to know that I do not regret staying as long as I did." "Mom, you do not have to." "Let me finish. I do not regret staying, because staying meant I got to raise you. And yes, I wish you had not witnessed what you witnessed. I wish I had protected you better. But you grew up to be this incredible man who stands up against injustice, who protects people who cannot protect themselves, who turned pain into purpose. And I do not think you would be that person if you had grown up in an easy, uncomplicated household. Your strength came from learning to survive. Your compassion came from understanding suffering. Your courage came from watching me be afraid and deciding you would not live in fear. That is not how anyone should learn those things, I said. No, it is not. But it happened, and we survived, and now we get to do something meaningful with what we learned. That is not nothing, Michael. That is actually everything. She was right. Our trauma was not meaningless. It was not a waste. It was terrible and wrong and should never have happened. But it did happen, and we could not change that. All we could do was decide what to do with the scars it left behind. I chose to turn my scars into service, into advocacy, into protection for people who needed protecting. I chose to become the person who intervened, who stood up, who said no more. Not just for my family, but for all the families like mine. That is what it means to be an adult. I have learned, not the legal definition or the chronological milestone, but the choice to take responsibility, to use whatever power you have to make things better, to stand up even when you are terrified, to protect even when protection might cost you everything. I did that on my 18th birthday. I stood between my mother and my father. I caught his fist midair. I looked into his eyes and showed him that I was no longer a scared little boy, and in doing so, I became the man I needed to be. That night cost me my father, my childhood home, my sense of family as I had known it. But it gave me back my mother. It gave me peace. It gave me a purpose. It gave me the foundation for a life that matters. And 3 years later, I can say with absolute certainty, it was worth it. Every hard moment, every tear, every nightmare, every session in therapy, every time I had to explain my history to someone new, every sacrifice, all of it was worth it to know that I stood up when it mattered most. I was a scared little boy for 10 years, but on my 18th birthday, in the span of a single moment, when I caught my father's fist and said no more, I became a man, not because of my age, but because of my choice. And that man has spent the last 3 years building a life dedicated to making sure other scared little boys and girls do not have to wait until they are 18 to be safe. That is my story. That is my purpose. And that is what my 18th birthday really meant. Thank you for listening to my story of growing up faster than I ever wanted to. I have left 2 more stories on your screen, both from young men who learned that sometimes becoming an adult does not happen at 18. It happens the moment your family needs you to be strong. Click on whichever one speaks to you. And if you want to join our community of people who understand what it is like to be forced to grow up overnight, that notification bell is waiting. Until tomorrow, remember, age is just a number, but courage defines who you really are.